Ancient Greek city-states are usually famous for two things: the construction of monumental temples to their gods and their invention of political systems. Because while they may have worshipped many deities, they only invented one type of government: democracy, from the Greek word demokratia, meaning rule of the people. Democracy has since evolved into a political system that most countries on Earth have adopted, or at least claim to have adopted. But ancient Athens, with its experiment in letting citizens vote and debate over policy, is also the last place on Earth where democracy flourished, before it was eventually snuffed out. So what's the secret to this amazing form of government? Why don't we see any surviving examples in the ancient world? The first true democracy was born around 1850 BC, when the citizens of Athens kicked out their monarchy and established a system where all male citizens could vote for leaders who would represent them in an assembly. However, although democracy means rule by the people of ancient Athens weren't exactly inclusive. Only free adult males who were born in Athens could be considered citizens, which left out women. Foreigners and slaves, who made up a majority of the population. Despite this limited franchise, democracy took root in Athens and spread to other city-states, like a wildfire stoked by the winds of change. After all, being ruled by an elite few was less appealing than being ruled by the many. Democracy wasn't the only form of government during the classical period. Just across the Aegean Sea, the Spartans maintained their authoritarian helot state while maintaining their warrior ethos. They distrusted the concept of equality, fearing that it would lead to complacency and weakness in battle. Their suspicion of democracy was shared by their close neighbors, the oligarchies of Corinth and Thebes, who preferred to maintain control in the hands of the wealthy. Sparta even attempted to use its military strength to suppress the growing democratic influence of Athens. Starting the 30-year Peloponnesian War in 431 B.C. Unfortunately for Sparta, their soldiers didn't know how to take a day off. After devastating the countryside, they ended up coming down with a bad case of malaria, which killed their entire army. As the war dragged on, Athens not only survived Sparta's invasions, but its democracy actually grew stronger. During this conflict, Cleisthenes introduced reforms that allowed any male citizen to propose a law and put it up for debate. This practice of argumentative lawmaking became the cornerstone of Athenian democracy. Any male citizen could accuse another of wrongdoing and bring them to court. If found guilty, they could be fined or even put to death. The courts themselves were staffed by juries of randomly selected citizens, and even generals were accountable to these courts. After all, democracy demands not only that leaders should serve the people, but that they should do so without fear of reprisal. And so, the Athenians pioneered the art of impeaching generals for their crimes. In the end, though, the Peloponnesian War devastated Athens, allowing Sparta to win the war and giving rise to the Macedonian kingdom, which soon conquered Greece. Yet despite the collapse of the Athenian Empire, the principles of democracy lived on. It would take almost 2 millennia for these ideas to catch on again, this time across the Mediterranean, in a land far, far away. Rome. Rome was founded in 753 BCE by Romulus, who promptly murdered his twin brother Remus for making fun of his new kingdom's lack of walls. Over the next several centuries, Rome fought a series of wars with neighboring Italian peoples, eventually conquering the entire Italian peninsula. By the mid-200s BC, Rome was enjoying the spoils of war and engaged in serious self-reflection. This included a major overhaul of their government. In 509 BCE, the Romans overthrew their Etruscan king and established a republic with elected officials, who represented the interests of the people. This republican system, though, had some significant flaws. The patrician class of landowners dominated the Senate and used their power to keep the plebeians, or common folk, in check. For example, the plebeians couldn't even marry a patrician. So if a plebeian woman was betrothed to a patrician man, she would actually lose her citizenship. These disadvantages drove the plebs to open revolt, forcing the patricians to come to the bargaining table. Eventually, the two sides agreed to establish a number of checks against patrician power, including the right for plebeians to elect their own officials and make their own laws, which were binding even on the patricians. While there were still some restrictions on their rights, this marked the beginning of Rome's democratic development. However, Rome's expansionism knew no bounds. And as they continued to conquer more land, they began to import more and more slaves. This had the effect of decreasing the proportion of free citizens and increasing the wealth of the upper classes. By the late Republic, Rome had become an oligarchy controlled by a small group of elites who amassed great fortunes through exploitation, such as the notorious Crassus family. To make matters worse, these oligarchs were now fighting in civil war over who would succeed Julius Caesar. By the time Augustus came to power, he was able to establish the autocratic rule of an emperor while suppressing the memory of the Republic. The die was cast. Rome's democratic institutions failed because of internal strife, corruption, and the emergence of powerful individuals willing to use their influence to gain ultimate power. But across the seas, democracy had taken root in places as far away as India. After a long period of foreign domination, India experienced a wave of nationalist fervor that led to independence in 1947. Soon after, the Indian Constitution was drafted, establishing a federal union of states committed to justice, liberty, and equality for all. Although the subcontinent was divided along religious lines, creating Pakistan and Bangladesh, India remains the world's largest democracy to this day. Similarly, Indonesia won its independence from the Dutch East India Company in 1945, enduring a brutal 4-year war to secure it. Its current constitution was established in 1945, promising its people political rights, economic, and social freedoms, as well as the right to work and to form labor unions. South Africa's journey to democracy was much longer and more fraught with peril. Under the racist regime of apartheid, non-white citizens were denied basic human rights and subjected to strict racial segregation. A global movement to boycott South Africa's goods helped weaken its economy and convince its leaders to negotiate with black leaders such as Nelson Mandela. Once imprisoned for his activism, Mandela went on to become South Africa's first black president. Inaugurated in 1994, these 3 examples demonstrate how democracies can emerge out of nationalist struggles against colonial powers or undemocratic governments. They also demonstrate the challenges inherent to democratic systems. From the threat of external forces to internal strife, democracies are fragile experiments that require constant care and attention to survive. The biggest problems facing democratic governments today stem from the nature of democracy itself. One of the greatest strengths of a democratic society is its responsiveness to the people. Leaders rely on votes to stay in office and therefore need to respond to the needs of their constituents. However, voters aren't always well informed about the issues and candidates vying for their votes. This is especially true in representative democracies like the United States, where citizens vote for representatives who legislate on their behalf. Sometimes these representatives stray too far from their constituents' views, leading to dissatisfaction and calls for revolution. At other times, the media becomes overly negative and polarized, further dividing the public and undermining trust in democratic institutions. Another problem is the potential for democratic backsliding. When a democracy is faced with a crisis or a charismatic leader willing to bend the rules, it can be tempted to abandon its principles in favor of stability or order. Take, for example, the recent events in Afghanistan, where the democratically elected government was overthrown by the Taliban in a matter of weeks. Or in Myanmar, where a military coup overthrew the government and reinstated military rule. In both cases, years of democratic progress were undone in an instant, highlighting the fragility of democratic institutions in the face of extremism and authoritarianism. So why do some democracies fail while others survive? Some scholars argue that it all comes down to education. A citizenry that is poorly educated or misinformed is more susceptible to propaganda and manipulation, which can lead to the rise of authoritarianism. Others point to the role of economic inequality, arguing that when the gap between the rich and poor becomes too wide, it creates instability and opens the door to extremism. Still, others emphasize the importance of strong institutions and the rule of law, arguing that without them, democracy cannot flourish. Ultimately, the survival of a democracy depends on a complex interplay of factors, and each nation must find its own path to stability and prosperity. But one thing is clear: the fate of democracy rests in our hands. It is up to us to protect and defend democratic institutions, to fight against those who seek to undermine them, and to ensure that the flame of freedom continues to shine brightly for generations to come. We hope you enjoyed this episode of HistoroMystic. If you did, make sure to leave us a like and subscribe so you never miss an epic story from history. And if you want to learn even more about the fascinating world of ancient Greece, we highly recommend checking out our other videos on the Helladic kingdoms. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time on HistoroMystic.